Welcome back to Denver Baptist G3 Groups to week number 5 of Church Elders and also Genesis 37 through 40. We're clicking right along through this book, pretty much halfway done, a little over halfway done with Church Elders. Hang in there. Who is Jesus is coming up next, and the Gospel of Luke's going to be here before we know it. It should be the beginning of December, I think. So just a couple more weeks in Elders and Genesis, and then we jump into something that might be a little bit more comfortable for you or knowledgeable to you, who is Jesus, and then Luke. But I think we're going to learn a lot in that study as well. So looking forward to that. Church Elders, chapter 5, Lead Without Lording. An important chapter, a chapter that, he kind of says, you might wonder why I put that in there, but it's an important chapter for elders to know and church members to know that elders are to lead without lording it over. He says there on 72, he said it might seem superfluous to devote a chapter to the topic of leadership in a book about elders. Isn't it obvious that elders lead in the church? Perhaps, but sometimes we lose sight of the obvious when things get crazy. And then down there at the bottom of 72, he says that church members might wonder too. Sometimes a member plays along with a lay elder leadership so long as elders guide the church in a direction that members like. But when church elders take the wrong fork in the road, the member balks. Who does he think he is? The member complains, I was in a Bible study with him for 10 years. He's no better than me, and now suddenly he's calling the shots. And so I've talked to some people. One of the biggest things, one of the biggest challenges to moving from the kind of church model we have right now to an elder-led model is for those in the congregation to realize that lay elders are just as much an elder as staff guys are. And so he's saying here that sometimes that the members bulk up. I was in a Bible study so-and-so for so many years. How does he think he can lead me now? But if he has been called by God to be an elder of the local church, lay or staff, that they are there to lead out spiritually in the church. And so he says there on 73, before that next topic there at the bottom of that paragraph, he says, given this atmosphere, who is an elder, let alone a church, to tell anyone how to live or what to believe? Do elders really have authority to lead in the church? That's the question. Do elders really have the authority to lead in the church? And then he starts in this idea of authorized to lead. He says, let's start by reviewing 3 interchangeable names given to the role in the New Testament. Though these 3 titles carry slightly different connotations, they all contain the idea of authority and leadership. First, elder. Elder is a term that implies wisdom or experience. You go to an elder for counsel and guidance. Elders have moral authority. When they talk, people listen. Pastor, shepherd. Shepherds have charge over the flocks. They lead the sheep from place to place. Can you imagine a shepherd who didn't care which way the flock wandered? Overseer. This term describes someone who watches over things or people. So elder, pastor, shepherd, overseer, they all have this idea of leading, and that's why they're used and helpful for understanding the role of an elder. Then on 74, he gives several verses that kind of backs up this reality. So 1 Timothy 3, 1 Timothy 5, 1 Thessalonians 5, Hebrews 13, 17. So look over those, pay attention to those. Let me just hit Hebrews 13, 17. Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they keep watch over your souls as those who will give an account. So does that elder have the right to lead me? The Bible says, yeah, and to submit to the elder because he keeps watch over your souls, and he must give an account for it. And so he talks there on 74 at the bottom there, lounging in the luggage. And so what he says, he's really getting into this idea of how helpful lay elders have been in his life and ministry. On 75, halfway down, he says that my congregation has been blessed time and time again by courageous lay elders who provide a needed leadership at key moments. He thinks of John, he says, who helped navigate through this constitutional revision in his church. He thinks about Tim, who was there intense meetings, watching him patiently and calmly diffuse and feuds between members and even church staff. So John's helped him immensely in writing the new Constitution and revising his church. Tim was there to be a cool head in the midst of tense meetings. He talks about Matt and the need for expanding the building, how he helped with that. He talks about Rick and Clay, who helped pilot through a complex pastoral search experience. He talks about a guy named Bill who currently has a full-time job, but also spares his time to help out in shepherding and leadership and coaching. And he's also coaching Jeremy, he says. And so he looks at these things and says that he could go on and on. He could fill up the rest of this chapter with names and stories from his personal elder hall of fame. He says it has been a privilege to partner with men who loved this flock enough to make hard decisions, establish gospel-shaped policies, toil for church unity, persevere through setbacks, and sacrifice hours for congregation in meetings, conversations, and prayer. Authority wielded by godly, loving men brings life, unity, and fruitfulness to local churches. The churches benefit themselves when they honor the authority. Hebrews 13:17. And so without these godly lay elders, his church would not have been what it came to be. God has gifts and talents for guys who are in the lay elder position that immensely helps the church out. And they are to be likewise looked at as pastors, as shepherds, as overseers, and to lead out in that authority given by God. He says there on 77, leading without lording. So leading without lording, the title of the chapter, but here we are really honing in on it. He says that Jesus and the apostles shared your concerns. They not only authorized elders to lead, but they also radically recast leadership as humble, sacrificial service to the followers. Peter affirmed the elders' responsibility as overseers and shepherds. But in the same breath, he called for elders to lead in a meek, exemplary manner, not lording it over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock in 1 Peter 5:3. And so leading without lording is so important. And then again, he jumps into some scriptures there in Matthew 20 and John 13. John 13 there on page 78, he says, "So if the Lord and teacher have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example," Jesus says, "that you are also to do just as I have done. I assure you, a slave is not greater than his master, and a messenger is not greater than the one who sent him." So that's in John 13:14-16. He says, that night Jesus stripped down and washed the dirt from the disciples' feet with his own hands. The next day, he was stripped again, and those same hands were nailed to a cross in order to wash the sin from his disciples' souls. Those who stand forgiven at the foot of the cross look at leadership and greatness in an upside-down way that scandalizes the world. And so a good Christ-like leader is a servant, is a humble leader who leads out the way Jesus did, who washed his disciples' feet. And then he talks about structuring the servant for servant leadership. He says on page 79, he says, "Consider 6 corporate habits that can help elders and congregations serve one another the way Jesus served." So number 1, choose humble elders. He says the simplest and most effective thing a church can do is to develop an intentional process for screening potential elders, and then be sure to select humble men. As we saw in chapter 1, the qualification list for elders stipulate that the men must be gentle, not quarrelsome, and not arrogant, not hot-tempered. So choose humble elders. On page 80, delegate deacons. Elders are not only they're not the only office in the church, he says. The apostles they appointed deacons. At the risk of oversimplifying their job descriptions, deacons nurture church unity by caring for the logistical, administrative, and physical needs of the church. Delegate deacons. Number 2, remain accountable. All elders are to remain accountable. Number 3, they're to honor the word. He says an elder should put himself continually under the word in all his teaching, worship, and ministry. This reminds both him and the congregation that his authority is contingent and that the Bible alone is absolutely authoritative in the church's life. Then replicate yourself on page 82. Replicate yourself. He says, in addition to perpetuating the church's leadership, focusing on training helps elders to stay humble. It's pretty hard to hoard power while simultaneously releasing it to others. So replicate yourself and then trust the congregation. Good chapter, helpful chapter, and it's a chapter elders need to read and reread over and over and over again. With that being said, let's jump into our Bibles for this week, Genesis chapter 37 through 40. we're getting into some interesting, cool stories, probably stories that you remember and you maybe have not read in a little while, and you're coming back and saying, oh yeah, I remember all this stuff. And so this week I'm going to focus in on Genesis chapter 37. Genesis chapter 37 is going to help us to see the narrative as it plays out for the next several chapters. So here we have Joseph and his dreams. We see at the beginning that Israel, or Jacob, loved Joseph more than any of the other sons because he was a son of his old age. And so you might remember several chapters back that you had this Jacob and Esau. And so Esau was more beloved by his father, Isaac, and then Jacob was kind of the mama's boy. But now you see this favoritism going down again. So Joseph is more loved than the other brothers by Jacob. So Jacob makes him this robe of many colors, which didn't sit very well with his brothers. So he's got this Gucci sweater, basically, if you would these days. This nice, super nice robe of many colors, and his brothers are jealous. And so, but you see this robe of many colors showing its head over and over and over. Verse 23, you see that, so when Joseph came to his brothers, they stripped him of his robe, the robe of many colors that he wore. In verses 31 through 33, then they took Joseph's robe and slaughtered a goat and dipped the robe in blood, and they sent the robe of many colors and brought it to their father and said, this is what we found. Please identify whether it is your son's robe or not. He identified that it is my son's robe. And fierce animals have devoured him. Joseph is without doubt torn to pieces. And so we see this jealousy over this robe popping its head up over and over and over again. But I like what one commentator says. He says that the ultimate irony in this story is, and so we're looking over and over at Joseph. He says the ultimate irony in this story is at the end, such royal honor does not reside in the house of Joseph. So you see this royal robe of many colors. It says the irony is it does not reside in the house of Joseph, but the house of Judah. Focus on Genesis 49 for a little while later on in your studies. Very important. He says, here the larger narrative takes over and assures that the outcome of the events leads to the house of Judah and its king. And so we see here this story of Joseph and his dreams. And so his dad says he's his favorite. He makes him this robe. And then Joseph has these dreams. And so Joseph first has a dream. In 37:6, he said to them, hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright. And behold, your sheaves gathered around, and they bowed down to my sheaf. So this is his dream. He tells it to his brothers. Again, doesn't sit well. His sheaf stands up. His brothers bow down to it. Then in verse 9, then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, behold, I have dreamed another dream. Behold, the sun, the moon, and the 11 stars were bowing down to me. And so this dream didn't sit well with his brothers. The robe don't sit well with his brothers. The be loved by the dad doesn't sit well with his brothers. And so we see there in verse 12 that Joseph is sent away to go give a report of how his brothers are doing. So Jacob sends Joseph away, go get a report. And so what's crazy is this is a big task, but Joseph just does it just like that. He's very obedient to the call. I like what one commentator says. Actually, it's a book from Vodi Bakum. If you have this book right here, if you can see it, Joseph, the Gospel of Many Colors. I've used this one a lot in the Joseph stuff. It's really good. If you want to pick up an extra book, if you want some extra reading, Joseph, the Gospel of Many Colors by Vodi Bakum. Vodi says this, says, anyone who has ever had a 17-year-old son can imagine what it would be like to send him on a multi-day, 50-mile journey alone by foot or on a beast of burden. He says the modern mind boggles at the very thought. Will he be safe? Will he get lost? Will he be afraid? Will his food last him and his water last him? And in Joseph's case, will he come to harm when he encounters his brothers? This is a monumental task. As such, it serves to highlight Joseph's obedience. So Joseph, this beloved son, is obedient to the father, and he goes and does what his father tells him to do. And so the story goes that Joseph comes to his brothers, and they see him coming from a distance. They see that robe of many colors coming, and they have this idea to do away with Joseph. First, they're going to kill him. Then, that Reuben comes along and says, hey, let's just put him in the well. And then Judah comes along and says, let's sell him. And so you see that this crazy event taking place where this obedient son goes to his brothers. His brothers don't like him, and they try to do away with him. But what's crazy is the irony of what happens. You have this promised, beloved son leaving the promised land to go check on his brothers, and then he's sold. And who's he sold to? He's sold to the Ishmaelites, the rejected heir of Abraham's descendant, right? He's sold to the promised son is sold to the rejected heir and taken off into captivity down in Babylon. And so when you read of this and you read of Joseph obeying his father, what we got to remember is Joseph stepped out of the promised land for good. The next time we see Joseph coming back into the promised land is Exodus 13:19, when his bones are brought back up out of the Exodus. His dead bones are brought up out of the Exodus. So Joseph leaves the promised land for good. He leaves it, and he says, Bauckham continues, he says, one inescapable truth we find in Genesis 37 and elsewhere in the Joseph story is that his obedience does not guarantee success or ease. You think of missionaries who are obedient to the call of God. You think of William Carey and Adoniram Judson, these guys who are obedient to the call of God, but that call brought great pain and suffering in their life, but for the greater cause. And so that just because our obedience does not guarantee success or ease. We can't say, Lord, I followed you all these days. Why is this happening to me? No, we know that what men meant for evil, God meant for good. And so somehow God works all these things out for our good. And Bauckham continues, says, this is not a feel-good story wherein the hero returns victorious. This is a tale of redemption in which Joseph pays the unthinkable price for a purpose much greater than he. And so we see that the brothers see him coming in 37:18, and they decide to kill him. And then one ultimately saves the lives of his brothers, right? And so you have Reuben saying, hey, don't kill him. Judah says, hey, let's sell him to the Ishmaelites. But this one who's rejected by his brothers, ultimately, the one they want to kill saves their lives because of the famine. Well, you might know as we read on later on. And so here we have this obedient son who's loved by the father, who's sold for some pieces of silver, who gets wrongly accused down in Egypt with Potiphar's wife. Is anything coming to mind here? Remember our biblical theology stuff. Is anything coming to mind? We are thinking of Jesus, who his brothers did not believe in him, who was sold for silver, was wrongfully accused, who was the loved son of the Father, who saves his people through his obedience. And so we see in this the greater Savior to come in Jesus, who was obedient to the point of death, even death on the cross, who was despised, rejected, a man of sorrows, comes to save you and me. And so, but as we're reading this, we're still reading with Joseph and Judah running side by side. We're thinking Joseph's the main character, but we're going to see that Judah is the one whom the line of the tribe of Judah comes through. So hope this is a good week for you. Keep on reading. Again, as always, email, text if you have any questions, concerns, comments about this week's scripture reading or elder book reading. So God bless. Have a good week. We'll see you next week.